History as it happens, November 19th, 2024. Oblivion in the age of Trump.
For the first time in our history, the president had not just lost an election, he tried to prevent the peaceful transfer of power as a violent mob breached the Capitol.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible.
Those who choose to continue to support is a dangerous gambit by objecting to the results of a legitimate democratic election will forever be seen as being complicit in an unprecedented attack against our democracy.
They were peaceful people. These were great people. The crowd was unbelievable. And I mentioned the word love, the love in the air. I've never seen anything like it.
We believe that the evidence described by my colleagues today and assembled throughout our hearings warrants a criminal referral of
described in the indictment.
Donald
It was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government.
Oblivion is an ancient, imperfect legal and moral mechanism for ending episodes of political violence, says the scholar Linda Kinstler. Would an act of oblivion help us bury the rupture caused by the assault on our democracy on January 6, 2021? Well, the courts delivered justice to hundreds of rioters, but the man who incited the mob is going to get away with it. And seeking justice without recrimination remains difficult. How might our nation move on? That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Right now, we're going to live through it, right? We have the Trump administration returning to power, and if Democrats want to have any chance at preserving or protecting, to say nothing of advancing their own agenda, there has to be some acknowledgement or like some pragmatic approach to governing that requires them to speak to the people they have disavowed because of their crimes against the nation, right? So that's the kind of politics that I'm talking about.
To memorialize the anniversary of January 6th, President Biden addressed the nation from the Capitol Rotunda. He invoked history, equating Donald Trump's riot with the gravest threats our republic has faced.
This is where the House of Representatives met for 50 years in the decades leading up to the Civil War. This is on this floor. It's where young Congressman of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, sat at desk 191. Above him, above us, over that door leading into the rotunda, is a sculpture depicting Cleo, the muse of history. In her hands, an open book in which she records the events taking place in this chamber below. Cleo stood watch over this hall 1 year ago today, as she has for more than 200 years.
Biden said dedicating a speech to condemning the insurrection from the year before wasn't about being bogged down in the past.
It's about making sure the past isn't buried. That's the only way forward. That's what great nations do. They don't bury the truth. They face up to it.
Well, we know how Americans have faced up to January 6. Some have dismissed it as a minor disturbance for which Trump cannot be blamed. Others have looked to the courts in the hope Trump would be tried and convicted, possibly imprisoned. Nearly 4 years later, the work of resolving this rupture remains incomplete. In an op-ed for the New York Times, the scholar and author Linda Kinstler cited something President Biden said in his speech on the third anniversary of January 6, delivered this year near Valley Forge.
We speak of possibilities, not carnage. We're not weighed down by grievances. We don't foster fear. We don't walk around as victims.
Well, in Kinstler's view, the president was inviting voters to imagine a future in which January 6 no longer weighs so heavily on the public mind. A future in which the nation has fully reckoned with what occurred that day and who was responsible and where we can finally move on. That future, she writes, will not and should not arrive before Trump himself goes to trial for his role in the insurrection, and possibly for some years after that. And there remains the distinct possibility that he may, in fact, never face real accountability. These words were published in June, and we know now because he won the election, Donald Trump will never face real accountability for his crimes. And those who warned that using the court system to keep Trump from returning to office would backfire appear to be right today. Meanwhile, hundreds of people who broke into the Capitol on January 6 have either pled guilty or have been convicted. How should we feel about them, these fellow citizens who tried to subvert our democracy based on lies and ignorance? Is there a way forward for our troubled nation? In her essay, Kinstler introduced me to a concept I've never thought of: oblivion. Now, the dictionary definition of oblivion is the state of being unaware or unconscious of what is happening. It also has historical meaning. As Kinstler writes, in those times of profound division, hatred, and ill will, politicians remember the power of an act of oblivion, an ancient, imperfect legal and moral mechanism for bringing an end to episodes of political violence. These acts were invoked when forgiveness was impossible, she writes, yet when pragmatism demanded a certain strain of forgetting, a forgetting that instead of erasing unforgivable transgressions, paradoxically memorialized them in the minds of all who had survived their assault. Rather than rely on the courts to deliver impossible and unattainable forms of reckoning, Kinstler says, oblivion provided opportunities for the extra-legal recognition of political and moral wrongs, and reminded its subjects of the desire for and necessity of coexistence. The words of Linda Kinstler, a junior fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows and the author of Come to This Court and Cry, How the Holocaust Ends. She has written extensively about the politics of memory and legal history. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So when I first read your op-ed, which is now called a guest essay in the New York Times, it was in the summertime when it was published, and it was the most thought-provoking op-ed I've read all year. As far as op-eds go, I think we all read a lot of them. We forget them within a day or two. This one has been on my mind the entire time, and I never forgot about it. So here we are in November after the election talking about your op-ed about oblivion. I was unfamiliar with this historical concept of oblivion. What is it, and what attracts you to this understanding or approach to the study of memory and history?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for saying that about the piece. It was many, many years in the making. So I would actually describe oblivion as a memorial technique. What I often speak about are, what are called acts of oblivion. These were formal legislative acts. Sometimes they were created and enforced by parliaments and legislatures in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And other times they were laws of oblivion that were kind of delivered by monarchical edict. Listeners might be familiar with, for example, the 1660 Act of Oblivion that reinstituted the British monarchy after the English Civil War, or the far more recent Spanish Pact of Oblivion that sought to bury the memories of their conflict. And so I became really fascinated with the idea of oblivion as a technique of essentially what we would call transitional justice today, as a way of acknowledging something that has gone so wrong in a society, that has profoundly riven the bonds between citizens and rulers and between subjects themselves, and became really fascinated by how these things worked, right? To talk about something that's an act of oblivion, it's a really poetic term. It really sounds quite mysterious. And when you look at them in the archive, I went down to the Library of Congress, to the law library there, and started picking out the acts of oblivion that they have. And you can see, at least in the US context, for example, after the Revolutionary War, there were many acts of oblivion passed in an effort to reintegrate royalists into the body politic, because it was understood that it would be counterproductive and even destructive to the fragile new country to vehemently pursue the prosecution of every single royalist. So in a sense, it was this kind of peacemaking mechanism that dates back to ancient Greece, but I think even further, in fact, that paradoxically memorialized the events that had occurred, whether it be a civil war, a war between states, or an interpersonal conflict, by demanding a particular kind of, I'm hesitant to say forgetting, but a pragmatic approach to the past.
Well, you call oblivion a strain of forgetting, but it's also used to memorialize events. So there's a contradiction there. How do you reconcile that? How can we forget something that we're memorializing?
Absolutely. Right. And I'm so glad you asked this question. And the best way I can explain it is by referring back to what is considered the original act of oblivion, upon which all of these early modern and late modern iterations are based. And that comes to us from 403 BCE, from the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War and the reign of the 30 tyrants in Athens, where you have the democratic forces of the Greeks who eventually overthrow and depose the tyrants who had taken control of the city. And the Democrats, as part of their attempt to reimpose their laws upon the city, mandate that every single person, including the tyrants themselves, if they wish to be reintegrated, swear an oath never to remember the crimes of the oligarchy. And of course, whenever you make such an oath, you are promising always to remember that which you have promised to forget. So that's what I mean when I say it's a memorial technique, right? It's not actually about forgetting, it's about thinking about how not to, quote unquote, make bad use of memory, as the scholar Nicole Leroux put it. And part of what fascinates me about this is I do think that we are making bad use of memory in so many different ways in our society and politics and culture. And it seemed to me that in this kind of forgotten idea of oblivion, there might be a way out of this predicament that we've found ourselves in where we don't really know what to do with our extremely troubled past.
Oblivion doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness, correct?
Yeah.
Or the perpetrators of the rupture in society have to admit they've done wrong, right? If we're, as a society, going to move past this.
Yes, absolutely. It acknowledges that forgiveness is impossible, right? I think what it is that it says you cannot paper over events that are in such flagrant violation to the very fabric of society. You know, that there are some things that cannot be forgiven. And so what you have to do is you have to, quote unquote, forget them, right? You have to figure out a way to live beside someone who has, for example, killed one of your family members. And we often see this in kind of post-war, post-Civil War scenarios, that there has to be some kind of pragmatic politics that derives from this. And importantly, what you do see in every act of oblivion is that the top perpetrators are always excluded from any measures of forgetfulness or amnesty that might come along with the oblivion. So in Athens, you had the 30 tyrants themselves excluded. They were forced to choose between standing trial and exile. And similarly, after the English Civil War, you know, Charles II had every single person who signed his father's death warrant tried and had a warrant put out for their own deaths. And so there is a very vengeful element to it. I don't think it's this kind of gentle peacekeeping mechanism. It does have teeth.
About the American Revolution, this is a gap in my knowledge. Maya Jasanoff has written a book I have not gotten around to reading yet called Liberty's Exiles, where a lot of the former Tories or loyalists or royalists left the new United States. They didn't want to stay or they weren't wanted. They had lost their property, what have you. I mean, did it work, the act of oblivion? Did the new American colonists, well, they weren't colonists anymore. They were no longer subjects. They were citizens. Did they get along more or less and put the war behind them?
It's such an interesting question because, you know, what would it mean for these things to work? I forgot who said it, but it was, you know, one of the founding fathers who actually took it upon himself to represent the loyalists in their treason trials because he believed so firmly that that would strengthen the new United States rather than weaken it, and kind of really believed in this project. So interestingly, you know, one of the recommendations of the Continental Congress to the states was that there should be state acts of oblivion precisely to kind of reintegrate these loyalists. And many, many states didn't actually end up passing them. You do have a handful of them that were enacted. And Bernadette Myler, who's a legal scholar at Stanford, has documented how many of these operated. You had one that was used to fix a border dispute between Vermont and New Hampshire, for example. It was a mutating concept, and that's one of the reasons I find it so fascinating.
And it's an official act, right? It's a government, it's a piece of legislation,
yes,
if you will. It almost takes the onus off the people. Okay, we have done this officially to help them move past what has happened.
I wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms. I do think it's helpful that it is, you know, at least in the United States, it comes from the legislature in most instances. And so there is an element of it, you know, putatively like from the people, right? Yeah. But I do think what's unique about these mechanisms is that not only are they formal acts of law, as you say, but they also have a really strong rhetorical force, right? And they demand a particular performance of citizenship from their subjects, right? What they're essentially saying is, we are not going to fuel the fire that fed the war, and that doesn't only extend to the legal realm, right? So there's also a requirement of people not to raise the divisions in public speech, right? And that doesn't only mean not waging vengeful lawsuits.
In your piece, you make the point that Oblivion might be more effective, or maybe is a substitute for the legal system. So in the context of January 6th, you start your op-ed out with a trial of a January 6th rioter who really didn't do a lot of rioting. He was an older fellow with a cane, and he walked into the Capitol building, and he was on trial. Well, first I'd like to ask you, what attracted you to sit through all these trials? Because you sat through a lot of them to observe who's actually being charged here, and are they really a danger to the Republic?
I should say, my first book, Come to This Court and Cry, is essentially about denazification after World War II and the long arm of Nazi prosecutions. And I became really disturbed to see that, over the last decade or so, some of these prosecutions are still ongoing. And in fact, because they're going on so far after the events themselves, they're actually undoing some of the evidentiary facts that we know about the Holocaust and kind of undermining victim testimony. And that was a really disturbing situation to me. And it made me question the value of continuously turning to law as a place where we go to reconcile, just to fix these kinds of really, really profound and serious wrongs. And I do think in the January 6th example, it is, to my mind, akin to the process of denazification. Obviously you can point out they're, not analogous, but there are similarities that we can point out, right? The emphasis on prosecuting every single person who was there, I think, is really interesting. And so I went to the trials because I wanted to see actually what it looked like in practice. And so they were all taking place or many of them were taking place at the DC District Court just down the road. You can kind of see the range of reactions that the rioters have, right? Some of them said they would do it again and 100% kind of endorsed their actions, and others stood crying before the judge saying they didn't really know what they were doing and they were extremely contrite. And I think the point I was trying to make in the op-ed, which, originally wasn't conceived as a response to January 6th, but I had to say something about it, was that the Department of Justice, in using the mechanisms of law to try to help our country move on from President-elect Trump's vehement and violent rhetoric, actually might have made the problem worse. I think it's not a stretch to say that has been borne out given the recent results of the election. This
is a tough situation. I don't consider, and I'm not saying you consider it this way either, the January 6th stuff to be lawfare. However, a key piece of your argument is Oblivion is to let the rank and file not off the hook, but to absolve them so our society can move on. Similar to the pardons, I guess, of ordinary Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. But the perpetrators or the leaders have to be held accountable.
Yeah.
So an Oblivion situation is impossible when it comes to January 6th because Donald Trump never apologized. To this day, he still claims that the election was stolen from him.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's impossible. I think we could have taken that approach, but that is not what happened, right? It was a bottom-up approach to the investigation, where I would suggest it should have been top down if we were to follow this blueprint that we have from history.
Yeah, we would need to have Merrick Garland on the show to ask him what's been going on the last 4 years. But go ahead, I get your point.
Yeah. I mean, I would be interested to hear that. But there was this debate over what to do with the nonviolent January 6ers and whether it should be that anyone who was simply there should be tried. And I think there's a disconnect in the rhetoric about the event because the Democrats speak about, not proceeding vengefully, turning towards the future, being unburdened by what has been, for example, right? And at the same time are prosecuting every single person who was there, while as if for the Republican side, the argument is the reverse. So I think, to me, this indicates that like something is broken. There's a disconnect with how we think about accountability for the worst crimes against the nation.
Yeah, and people are living in different factual universes. I remember some Republicans saying that they were like tourists going through. And this fellow that you mentioned in your op-ed, Lynn Nestwood, he was in there for 10 minutes, didn't take anything and left. So to say that he was rioting is probably a stretch. But
I mean, maybe not. I think my point was mostly like what was interesting to me was his trial date started on the same date that Donald Trump's trial was supposed to start, right? And I had actually received a jury summons for that trial originally.
oh wow.
And it just seemed to me so strange that on this momentous date, it was March 4th, when we were supposed to have the former president sitting in the courtroom being forced to account for his crimes against the Republic. Instead, we had one of his followers who merely trespassed onto congressional property. That to me just illustrated how the kind of like wrong turn that had been taken with regard to these investigations.
Well, maybe an act of oblivion would establish a consensus or a single memory around which our country can coalesce, because the acts of that day are being memorialized differently, not to be confused with the histories that will be written of this chapter in the future. For instance, the people like the Proud Boys. I saw a headline today. Person's already asking for a pardon in advance for when Donald Trump is in office. I do not know what to do about that.
The important thing for me is, as you say, to not even like establish the facts of what occurred, because as you say, those will always be disputed, but to acknowledge that there was something that was so profoundly wrong about the events of that day that they threatened, as many people have said, the grounds upon which the U.S. is founded, right? The peaceful transfer of power, the congressional right to kind of certify the electoral vote, all of these things that are, underlie our very ability to kind of like live with each other here. And so I do think what appeals to me about acts of oblivion is that they, as you say, they mark ruptures, right? There's a way of memorializing something that has gone so wrong, and yet it's also a way of delineating it in time, right? Of attempting to say, look, something really, really horrible happened. We know that it happened. We don't want it to happen again. And so we're going to try to move forward while always remembering the wrongs in our mind so that we do not repeat them, And I think, to me, I'm really troubled by what I see as a kind of superficial approach to memorialization, right? You like put up a statue here, you have a ceremony there, and it allows people actually to kind of say, oh, I did it. Like, I don't need to think about it anymore. Elko Runia has this line where he says, the more memorials we build, the more we turn ourselves into people who did not do it. So there's this element of permissiveness that I think can accompany some of these shallower attempts at memorialization. And that's what I'm trying to push past.
I'm speaking to you today from Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol. This is where the House of Representatives met for 50 years in the decades leading up to the Civil War. This is on this floor. It's where young Congressman of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, sat at desk 191. Above him, above us, over that door leading into the rotunda, is a sculpture depicting Cleo, the muse of history. In her hands, an open book in which she records the events taking place in this chamber below. Cleo stood watch over this hall 1 year ago today, as she has for more than 200 years. She recorded what took place, the real history, the real facts, the real truth, the facts and the truth that Vice President Harris just shared, and that you and I and the whole world saw with our own eyes. The Bible tells us that we shall know the truth, and the truth shall make us free. We shall know the truth. Well, here is the God's truth about January 6, 2021.
Your family history helped bring you to this subject of oblivion, right? And you discuss this in your book, Come to This Court and Cry. I was reading reviews of it. Now I want to read the book. But your family background is really fascinating. Your mother's family was Jewish, but your paternal grandfather served with something called the Araj Commando during World War II. They were perpetrators of the Holocaust. Is that correct? And then he worked for the Soviet secret police. Talk a little bit about that in this context.
I was brought up in the Jewish tradition, and I was kind of taught, justice, justice, you shall pursue. And so that kind of underlies my real interest in the legal system and its operations and its manipulations. And I found, not only did my paternal grandfather serve in what was called the Araj Commando in what is now Latvia and was a perpetrator of the Holocaust, he then at some point became a KGB agent as well, and then disappeared in 1949. And the book follows the story of him and kind of his disappearance and, what we do not know about him, but also about one of his quote unquote colleagues in the Araj Commando, who is named Herbert Sukers, who has the ignominious honor of being the only Nazi whom Mossad is known to have assassinated. In other words, they took credit for his killing. And the book follows this strange proceeding in present-day Latvia where Sukers was subject to a posthumous pre-trial proceeding, essentially, 70 years after the events themselves, was trying to figure out if he could be directly held accountable for shooting a gun during the Holocaust, right? And it's like, what more evidence do you need of culpability than membership in a literal Nazi killing commando? But in fact, that was not enough. It just felt like the whole ground was falling out from under me, and that law was reaching too far back into history and actually threatening established facts. And so Oblivion kind of came to me. I was talking to a colleague of mine about how this could be, how we got here. And he mentioned that there used to be these things called Oblivion clauses, and I just kind of captured my imagination, and I've been curious about them ever since.
After the U.S. Civil War, the pardons of the Confederates, I'll return to the subject now. The problem there, and also the failure to try Jefferson Davis for treason, was that the Confederates did not accept the outcome of the war. They instead fought to redeem the South. And by the time of the compromise of 1876-77 that brought Rutherford B. Hayes into the White House, a Republican, only a handful of southern states still had Republican governments. So the reconciliation came at the expense of African Americans in multiracial democracy, helped perpetuate the myth of the lost cause. It was a huge setback for this country. So is this a case where Oblivion didn't work?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. The post-Civil War era is really fascinating for this because you do have calls for Oblivion quite widely, in fact. And, it was almost uniformly the southern states who were begging for an oblivion for their crimes. There were many prohibitions against Confederate officers of holding public office. If you actually look at American newspapers, you can see how in the Southern papers, there was a debate over when these prohibitions should be lifted. So the thing I always also fascinates me about Oblivion is at least if you go back to the kind of original quote unquote oblivions of the ancient world, they did carry with them material measures. They did mandate not only the trials of the perpetrators, but also the return of confiscated property and restitution for losses during the war. And I think, one of the reasons it failed, that Reconstruction, as many scholars have pointed out, was a failure is that you didn't have those measures, right? There's a colleague of mine was just telling me about how in one instance, freedmen were given plots of land from their plantations, but then they were made to return them, right? There's this line from Frederick Douglass from the postbellum era where he, says, I look to Congress and I see the solid South still enthroned there. The minute that is no longer the case, we will join you all in calling for an act of oblivion, right? But if they're going to remain there, then we cannot do that because nothing has changed, in fact. And as you say, there has been no acknowledgement of the wrong of the war.
Yeah. The Rwanda situation, for instance, I talked about Rwanda on my podcast earlier this year. I didn't get too much into what happened after the genocide, but from what I gather, it's been the reconciliation that occurred there has been successful insofar there's been some forgiveness and they've been able to put that slaughter behind them to a certain degree, which I find amazing. To some degree, these things never really fade or can never really be forgotten, even as we memorialize them, right? I don't know if I'm making sense there.
I don't know that you could say that about Rwanda. It is held up as this successful example of international law being wielded to enact transitional justice. And indeed, it is the first example of genocide being prosecuted by using international law. But on the other hand, you still have efforts. There are still kind of like outstanding claims there. You still have reparations that are unpaid as a result of that genocide. What fascinates me about all of this is that precisely the transitional justice measures that you are pointing to are so inadequate in so many ways. And like, as a scholar, I think a lot about what we expect law to do. And I think at this moment in history, it's carrying a lot of water for people.
And the legal system has not solved the January 6th problem. There's no question about that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it has, I would argue, worsened it. Because now we're setting ourselves up for a situation in which there will be, it sounds like, almost certainly vengeful legal reprisals as a result, right? I do think like one of the most powerful things that President Biden could have done, or I guess arguably still could do, is pardon some of the January 6ers himself as an act of kind of political grace. But of course, in the world that we live in, that is like a total non-starter. But in a different political era, you could, it would be a different story perhaps. And after the Vietnam War, there was a presidential study commissioned to look at the use of amnesty throughout history. And they did go back to 403 BCE and kind of looked at every instance in which it was successful. And I think we're at a moment like that right now, or I don't know, maybe with the new Trump administration coming in, we're still not there. But at some point we will get there, and we will need to have answers to these really tough questions.
Yeah, well, he may pardon them all, but that's the wrong source of the pardon.
I am inclined to pardon many of them. I can't say for every single one, because a couple of them probably they got out of control. I would say it will be a large portion of them. They did a very... And it'll be very
you make a good point. I don't think I've heard anyone even suggest that over the past 4 years, that maybe at some point President Biden could have pardoned the people who were at the very bottom or the lower end of the infractions here. How about social media? How does that make it hard to have oblivion, or to put wrongs in the past so as a society we can move on and not be caught in this cycle of finger pointing?
It's no coincidence to me that this era of eternal memory has coincided with the explosion of internet memory in a way, that we have like ever more data that we preserve forever. Social media, of course, has created this ecosystem in which you can always be reminded of something that you did wrong or said wrong at any point in time. And
makes conversation almost impossible too, the competing realities.
Exactly. And, that is also kind of devastating for any kind of civic debate or public life. So, yeah, I think that there's, these things are all related. In another realm, we are in like a literal memory crisis that I've written about with relation to Oblivion, in that we are generating so much data that we cannot store it anymore. We don't have the energy resources to store it. And so now you see all these companies turning to nuclear power as a kind of last resort. So I'm really fascinated by what's going on and how we think about preservation and erasure as a society.
Your op-ed provoked some letters to the editor to the New York Times. Here is one from Bill Dingfelder in Philadelphia. If Bill is listening, hello, Bill. He said, when you spoke of clean slate laws, the altar of oblivion can truly come to life. Even so, implementation of such laws depends upon the gravity of the offense, changing times or other circumstances that ensure that punishments are not perpetual. In short, the spirit of her argument, meaning you, can and should live on, but only in particular circumstances that apply largely to individuals, not to entire societies. I thought you kind of made that point in your op-ed.
Thank you. I guess I agree with that letter. When it comes to criminal justice reform, I do think that Oblivion has a very potentially powerful role to play there. And that's why I was fascinated by like the fact that clean slate laws, that's the term that's being used to kind of describe some of these rollbacks of offenses that we see, in fact, being automated in many states across the country. I think that's a really, really wonderful development. The question of whether you can have it on a societal level is really good. And, that has to do with what people are willing to undertake. I don't think it's impossible that you could have it on a societal level. I just think it would demand the kind of serious approach to the past that, we're not at present capable of.
My sense from reading your op-ed is you're saying we have to do this. Here's a quote from your piece. Participating in political life meant living among one's former adversaries and offered a vocabulary with which to navigate that uncomfortable yet inescapable relation. I think our way of talking about these things is impoverished, and our society right now is not ready to move on. I do agree. At some point, we must. We can't have this hanging over us forever or just fueling the cycle, right?
I think right now we're going to live through it, right? We have the Trump administration returning to power, and if Democrats want to have any chance at preserving or protecting, to say nothing of advancing their own agenda, there has to be some acknowledgement or like some pragmatic approach to governing that requires them to speak to the people they have disavowed because of their crimes against the nation, right? So that's the kind of politics that I'm talking about, right? It's not about forgetting at all. It's about guarding the memory of what has gone wrong, indeed. And
that's a great point. Sorry to interject, but the other day, President Biden sat with President-elect Trump in the White House. Yeah. And then afterwards, there were questions. Well, you just said this guy's, a threat to American democracy. Now you're sitting here chummy with him. Yeah. To your point about we've been talking about each other in a certain way, but now we have to live with each other. And it makes it hard, to do that.
Right. And like in that instance, I would say it's more important to preserve, what they were doing there was preserving the veneer of normalcy in a way. And I think people would quibble with whether that was appropriate or not. But I see in that, perhaps this is an optimistic and naive reading, but like you can talk about politics of pragmatism that's not a politics of friendship. This is not a situation in which like your enemy becomes your friend. No, it's that you recognize that they are your enemy and you never forget what they have done. And you also understand that because of the fact that governance requires some kind of speech and cooperation, that this is what needs to be undertaken, right? And I think it's just a very complex and challenging thing to take on. And yeah, we don't have the kind of words at our fingertips to describe what we are doing, but maybe that will change. Out of this unprecedented situation will come some kind of language for that.
He has done what no president in American history, the history of this country, has ever done. He refused to accept the results of an election and the will of the American people. While some courageous men and women in the Republican Party are standing against it, trying to uphold the principle of that party, too many others are transforming that party into something else. They seem no longer to want to be the party of Lincoln, Eisenhower, Reagan, the Bushes. But whatever my other disagreements are with Republicans who support the rule of law and not the rule of a single man, I will always seek to work together with them to find shared solutions where possible. Because if we have a shared belief in democracy, then anything is possible. Anything.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, Max Boot on one of the most consequential presidents in American history.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
We'll talk to Max Boot about his biography of Ronald Reagan, the conservative hero, a pragmatic politician, continuities with the age of Trump, and Trumpian departures from the age of Reagan. That is next as we report History as It Happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. My newsletter every Friday. Go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.